This is Mark Krikorian. I'm Executive Director of the Center for Immigration Studies.
And this is Josh Bernstein. I'm the Immigration Policy Director at the Service Employees International Union.
So, Josh, DREAM is obviously being bandied about in Congress finally. 2 years late they got to it. I don't know, it seems to me the first thing I wanted to address is, do these young people that are covered by DREAM, do they have some kind of, right to this status, to legalization? In other words, do they deserve it? Is it something that we as Americans are obliged to give them? And I actually kind of have a opinion that may not be as far from yours on the merits of the concept of the law, but I'm kind of disturbed by the rights talk that I hear, that this isn't something that the American people should do as kind of an act of grace, but that it's owed these people. That's kind of the first thing that really concerns me, and they're factually not owed this legalization because young people often suffer from the mistakes of their parents. If your dad took out a mortgage that he couldn't afford, and you lose your house, your parents don't get a pass on the mortgage payments just because kids will be harmed. So,
so Mark, maybe I think those are things that definitely are worth talking about. We should definitely get into them, but maybe we should sort of let folks know. Not everybody who's tuning in might know even what the DREAM Act is, and probably there's some, we probably have some common ground about like what it does and who it affects and those kinds of things. So that just sort of preliminaries to get out of the way.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So basically, the DREAM Act is a piece of legislation that's been proposed in Congress that is intended to address or to focus on people who are the children of immigrants who were born in another country, and they were brought here illegally by their parents, mostly, years ago as children. And then basically the DREAM Act says if you were brought here illegally as children and you've grown up here and you stayed out of trouble, if you go on to graduate from high school, then you can get a temporary legal status called conditional status, and then then that status lasts for a number of years, and during those years you have to either go to college, either graduate from a community college or go 2 years towards a 4-year degree, or you need to serve in the military for at least 2 years. If you meet those conditions, then at the end of the time period, which is 10 years in the most recent version and 6 years in the earlier version, then you can get a green card, and then eventually you can work your way into becoming a citizen.
Right.
So would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically a fair summary. Now, there's at least 4 different versions now bandied about the Senate, but that's the basic idea, that people brought here before they turned 16 years old, and they jump through various hoops that you've described, educational or military service hoops, would then be able to convert this temporary status that they get right away when they apply into a permanent green card, and eventually, if they want to, citizenship. So yeah, I mean, the parameters of the proposal, I think, are pretty. There's not a lot of dispute there. The question is it a good idea or not?
Yeah, exactly.
And the first point I brought up,
affects. Maybe if you want to talk a little bit about the demographics, or I can.
Sure. Well, yeah. I mean, there isn't actually a lot of disagreement there either. The Migration Policy Institute actually did a report just recently, and it kind of reflected something that we at the Center for Immigration Studies had done several years ago on an earlier version of the bill, and their estimate is there's something like 2.1 million people who would be eligible for the legislation, although their estimate was less than half of them would actually be able to meet all of the various criteria. Something like 800,000+, almost 900,000 was their estimate of the number they guessed would be applying, would actually qualify.
So just to clarify for folks, there's about 2.1 million that would qualify if
Initially.
they were able to meet initially,
Right.
and if they were able to meet all of the the education requirements that we mentioned, or military service requirements, then their estimate is that only about 800,000 of those would actually be able to what you call jumping through those hoops,
Right,
in order to.
And I have every reason to think that's probably accurate. The question with the numbers for me is they're not taking into account the fraudulent applications, and because I actually think, and this is one of the concerns I brought out in my National Review Online piece on this, is that the fraud is likely to be enormous. Now, every program is going to have fraud if there's some benefit you're giving people. The problem is that in the versions of the legislation that I've seen so far, maybe it's kind of a moving target, but all the versions of it prohibited the Immigration Service from acting on any lies that were submitted in the applications. And I think
that's not true. I don't agree.
Well,
there's a specific provision that says that if you commit fraud, then you can be prosecuted and you can be put in jail for up to 5 years.
But the information in your application may not be used for prosecution of fraud or for immigration enforcement. It's kind of for show. That's my concern.
So let's just put it this way: we disagree about what the original DREAM Act said. If you look at because of criticisms like yours, they've really made it crystal clear that that's not the intention, and that's not what the bill says. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Why would you not allow prosecution of fraud? Nobody wants people to be able to qualify. And the other thing that's sort of when people talk about fraud is a little bit with this particular population. This is probably the least likely population that's going to. This is one of the programs that's going to be the hardest to defraud, because these kids, in order to qualify, they would have had to have been 15 years old or younger when they came here, and they have to have graduated from a high school here. They'll have school records, almost all of them. If they don't have school records, and school records are going to be pretty hard to falsify, if you don't have school records, then that's going to raise a red flag for DHS, and you have to prove that you came at that early age, and also that you came here 5 years before the bill was enacted. So again, it's like you're going to have to account for those 5 years as a child, which is pretty easy with health records, and there's things that are easy to prove if you really did it, and it's hard to come up with. It's not like some of the other programs in the past where you can go to an employer and they can make up stuff for you. It's not likely you're going to get a school district to do that.
Right.
So this group, there's not going to be too much fraud in this particular program. It'll be really hard for somebody to do that.
For the sake of argument, I'm happy to accept that, because the important, I think, issue here is the issue of principle. In other words, assuming that everything worked as advertised, is it a good idea? And I think that's what I really want to discuss, because the core principle behind the DREAM Act is that people brought here illegally and who have grown up here, in other words, kids who are, or at this point not kids, but young people who are psychologically and emotionally American. In other words, their identity was formed here, even though they weren't born here. In legal immigration, they call that the 1.5 generation.
Exactly.
They're not the first generation who are immigrant adults who grew up abroad. They're not the second generation who were born here. They're in between because they were born abroad but grew up here. And the question is, should those people be legalized? And I think there's an argument to make there, actually. But, and this is the big but, it should be much narrower than the scope of the current legislation, because people brought here at age 15, because it's up to, until you turned 16 you would qualify. I mean, if you were brought here before you turned 16. Teenagers, yes, they're not adults, but their identity is formed. I mean, they didn't grow up here. I have a 15-year-old, and if I snuck into Mexico with him and lived there, he would be an American psychologically for the rest of his life. He's formed already. It seems to me the issue has to be people brought as infants and toddlers, below age, say, 7 or something like that, because the Catholic Church uses 7 as the age of reason. That's when, and English common law does likewise. And it makes sense.
let me put a slightly different rationale, because I think your rationale makes sense. I think it's common sense, right? That if you were brought here at the age of 2 and you grew up here, it's a little late to start enforcing immigration law against that person, especially if they've done everything we asked them, if they stayed in school, if they have, not ever gotten in trouble with the law, the requirements that the DREAM Act puts out there, and then so I agree with you on that. We're in agreement on that, but I also think that there are some other strong reasons why you would want to do something like the DREAM Act, and one of the criteria and why I think that 15 is a fair age is whether or not you as an individual were the one who made the decision to come here, and at some point in that spectrum of 15, 16, 17 years or 18 years, it becomes more that it's responsibility of the adult to, as you become an adult, it becomes more your responsibility, hold you more responsible for that decision. And when you're younger, my ex-wife was 16 years old when she came here, so she would not have qualified. But she didn't decide to come here. She was still under the care of her parents, and her parents decided to come here, and she was kicking and screaming. And honestly, of the DREAM Act students that I've met that came in their in their middle teens like that, they're extremely, they almost never wanted to come here because they had established they had their friends, they had their school.
Sure.
They're being uprooted, and so if you're dragged here, or if you're brought here not by your agency, but by your parents' agency, then I think that's a different situation.
Well,
from somebody who was an adult and who made the decision to come here. We disagree on a lot of immigration things. I think that the ones who came here illegally as adults also should, we should figure out a way of taking care of their status. But for the kids who didn't decide, that seems more like a no-brainer.
But see, and I think what we have here is the two different visions of why some of these young people in this pool should be legalized. In other words, you're saying those who really weren't involved in the decision
right.
Should be able to get legalized. My sense is that it's those young people who don't know any other country who are the ones that.
So I agree with you. We're in agreement on that.
Yeah, no, but you're expanding the universe. Is my point.
I'm saying yes, exactly. That it's not for me. That's not the be all and end all. And I actually do think that in the sociological literature, I think kind of agrees with me that those who come in their early teens, they do adapt here, and then they become, they tend to speak here without an accent in English.
Like Henry Kissinger.
Well, like so many people that I know who maybe, I don't know when Henry Kissinger came here, but that's the age, if you talk to sociologists, when it's once you start getting into your late teens that you never lose your accent.
The interesting thing, though, is that the young people used as examples, as poster children for the DREAM Act, when you look through, they're almost always kids who were brought here at the kind of ages I'm talking about. In other words, there's an implicit acceptance. It seems to be a clear implicit acceptance by the advocates that the people they're going to hold forward as rationale for the DREAM Act are the kind of people I'm describing, rather than people who came here at 14 or 15. I've never seen a 14 or 15-year-old profiled in the media or anything like that. The people doing that, that walk from Miami to Washington, the Fresno State University student body president, they're all people who came here very young.
So there are, I just want to say that a lot of those people, they selected themselves, and especially in the early years, like most recently, a lot of those kids, very courageously, because they feel they are so American. They do the American, they're sort of in the hip tradition of American, movements and political. They want to engage the political process, and some in the last year or so have said, okay, I'm gonna, even how risky it is, I'm gonna tell the world that I'm an undocumented immigrant, and I'm gonna take the consequences, whatever they be, But in the past, the people who actually became what you call poster children were limited to the ones who got arrested and then were facing deportation, and then their communities kind of rallied around them. They were not selected by us, and neither those kids that came from Miami and walked, they called Trail of Dreams. They walked all the way from Miami to Washington D.C. To try and call attention to the situation faced by students like them. They picked themselves. Nobody asked them to do that. That's something that they just, they said, well, we need to do something. And they looked to the traditions like of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and they said, well, this is something that we can do. It's nonviolent. It's we're just trying to do the right thing. So, and if you just think about it logically, there's 15 different ages. Well, actually, you have to there's 15 different ages you could have come here, right? So about 2/3 of them are going to have come from 1 to 10. And about very few of them, only a handful of them, a smaller percentage would come when they were 13 or 14 or 15.
Yeah, but I mean, there's still a lot of people covered by those older ages, and it's a clear. See, even if I'm not even saying necessarily that some national advocacy groups plotted to put forward only these kids. I expect actually there was some of that, but let's assume there wasn't. The fact is, it reveals an implicit understanding that the public feels most sympathetic, and the issue resonates most with ordinary voters when you're talking about people brought here as very young. So
sure,
frankly,
I'll grant you that. So that's why we agreed on the younger group, and then we're saying, well, okay, what about the older group?
No, I understand. We agree on that. What I'm saying is, it seems to me it makes perfect sense for DREAM Act advocates to say, listen, this older group is contested. People don't agree on it, so let's pick the part where there is consensus. Kids brought here before 5 or 6 or 7.
But that doesn't
let's
really
pick their problem first, because they're obviously the most sympathetic group and the one that the public is most receptive to doing something.
I'll tell you, having met some of the ones who came when they were 12, 13, 14, 15 years old,
right?
They're very sympathetic too. They're beautiful. And just to, mostly, if you're in the older years, those are a lot of the ones who are not going to be able to meet the requirements of the DREAM Act anyways. And that's because it's much tougher. If you grew up and you speak, you come here at an age of 15 years old or 14 years old, and you have to, and a lot of times, you haven't, necessarily even completed the educational system in the country that you came from, and then you have to, turn around and be able to succeed in high school, because you can't qualify for the DREAM Act unless you graduate from high school.
Right.
And so there's already a cutoff, and it makes it harder and less likely anyways. So it sort of fits into what you're talking about. It's for the DREAM Act itself sort of selects out only a certain portion of those who are.
I understand what you're saying, but
and can we just go a little bit into, because in addition to that, I think maybe our listeners probably got what we're talking about on that.
Right.
But there's other rationales for the DREAM Act, in addition to the fact that it's kind of like it makes sense that somebody that didn't make the decision has a stronger claim on being able to get legal status than somebody who did make the decision. And then but in addition to that, there's just a question of, well, what's better for the rest of us, not just for them, right? And so are we better off if they have a stronger incentive, like that we know that if they stay in school and graduate from high school, that they are going to have a chance of getting legal status, and not if they don't? Are we better off if they have, if the ones who are able to go to college and or serve in the military are able to get legal status, so that then they can use the degrees that they earn? So first of all, are we better off if these kids who are going to be here one way or the other are better educated or not? And are we better off if they are, once they're educated, if they're able to take the jobs that they've been prepared for? If somebody gets a nursing degree, aren't we better off if they can be a nurse or a teacher or whatever the things that people, or even an entrepreneur? Aren't we better off if they're educated, and aren't we better off if they can work legally?
But see, that again, we have a different premise here, which is why we're on opposite sides of this debate. Mm-hmm. In the long run, we're better off if the immigration law is enforced, and it's clearly understood to be enforced, and people aren't rewarded who have broken it.
But that's a different question, because we agree, you and I, that the immigration laws are not enforced. I mean, we have different solutions, but we agree that there's 11 million undocumented immigrants in the country. I don't know, maybe you might have a different number, but that's
it's
the
about
consensus
11.
number.
Yeah.
And so there's obviously a problem here that needs to be solved. That's the big problem. And what we say is, well, you've got to sort of take the kids or the people that this group of people that weren't responsible for their situation and take them off the battlefield, and then let's deal. I agree with you. Let's deal with the bigger problems, absolutely. But that's kind of a separate thing from the DREAM Act. The DREAM Act is going to make it easier to enforce the law on everybody else, because that way Department of Homeland Security resources don't have to be used in enforcing the law against these kids. They can be more focused on others.
So you do want the adults to be arrested and deported then, apparently. Is that your premise? Because
no, like I said, we can talk about it. I think we shouldn't. That's not what we're supposed to be here for. But we can talk about how adults should be treated. But I think that we agree that we should have a system. The goal is the same for both of us. I don't think we want to have any undocumented immigrants in this country. We want to have everybody who's here be here legally by a combination of enforcement and sane or a system that works better. So we probably agree with the goal, but my point is, well, that's really hard. That's politically hard. There's a lot of loggerheads. There's something where we can actually kind of agree, which is let's take these kids off the table and make it easier to focus on the rest of the population and fix it.
Where we agree, though, is who are the kids, to get back to what we were talking about before. I think there is a lot of agreement about the very youngest, or people brought here at the youngest ages. There simply isn't agreement on older kids. And in fact, any kind of legalization, even of the younger kids, or those brought here at younger ages, is inevitably sending the message that to prospective illegal immigrants who aren't here yet, that, coming in, sneaking into the United States or overstaying a visa and keeping your head down long enough will get you some kind of reward. It may not even get you, the adult, an award, but at least your kids will get legalized. And so
let's be clear about what you're saying in this, because this is an area, I think, of a little bit of confusion for our audience, perhaps. So you're not saying that the DREAM Act itself would apply to these other people who are making the decision of whether to come here or not, because the DREAM Act only applies to people who've been here for at least 5 years on the date of enactment, right?
Yeah,
but you're saying that
some
there's
versions,
a message.
There's an earlier version that had a rolling amnesty, but yes,
but
it would only apply. Yes, it would not be that that people would say, "I want the DREAM Act specifically." It's that we would be sending yet again a message, which all amnesty programs, legalization programs send, is that if you get in, if you keep your head down, keep your nose clean, and you don't get caught, eventually we're going to let you stay if you stick around long enough.
So your idea is that those young people that we're talking about, we've just been talking about for the first 20 minutes here, they should sort of be held hostage or whatever, because we're afraid that some people in the future, and we don't know how many, because I honestly would think that people have other reasons for coming here, and that really whether we pass the DREAM Act or not is not going to factor that much into their decision. But you're saying that because that might factor into their decision, that we should then, even though it's in our interest, because of their education and their working, and it's kind of fair to them, even though all that's the case, we still shouldn't do it because of this possible message that we'd be sending.
My point is, I actually, like I said, am in favor of legalizing those who came at the youngest ages, but even a limited, narrower version, a DREAM Act 2.0, if you will, or at this point, 5.6.2 or something,
Fair enough.
has to have enforcement measures in it to try to offset the message that is always sent by legalization programs. So it seems to me, because the point is, we want to make sure future parents don't subject their children to this kind of situation. And we're going to disagree probably here on whether that could work or not, but that's one of my major concerns, is that a DREAM Act redux, a new and improved DREAM Act that narrowed the scope of the people covered, also would need to have significant enforcement measures as part of it in order to send, sort of to blunt the message of the amnesty itself.
Just as a matter of record, we've almost every Congress over the last 2 decades at least, has passed increased additional enforcement mechanisms. Whether it's more people and resources at the border, more cracking down on employers, it's different kinds of, more interior enforcement measures, and that, every Congress has passed, so we've had a lot of those enforcement measures. What we haven't had is something like the DREAM Act that sort of takes care of what the fairness issue or the self-interest to our, like what makes sense. And so I would say, well, we've done all that enforcement. We don't have to have them in the same bill. We've done that for so many years. It's time to do at least a little bit. And again, I agree with you. We're going to have to, when we do a comprehensive bill, when we fix immigration, which I hope, which I wish had happened this Congress, and hope it happens in the next Congress, is one of, my union that I work for, it's one of our most fervent desires is to fix our immigration system. We really want to do that. But I just don't think that, and that's where there's going to be a mixture of, and it has to be as part of fixing it of enforcement, but the enforcement all by itself doesn't really work and doesn't send the message that you're looking for, because it would have sent it by now.
Yeah, that's where we disagree. Yeah, I do agree. Congress has gone through certain motions regarding enforcement, mostly related to border enforcement, and then secondly to dealing with criminal aliens, non-citizens in jails who commit crimes. That's where most of the focus has been. The employment-related stuff, the tools available to this administration and the previous one were reasonably potent. The problem here is execution. The immigration law has not been comprehensively enforced because there are too many interests, both on the right and the left, who don't want it to be enforced. That's the basic problem, and we're getting beyond DREAM Act here, but that's the reason I think that the concern or the position that a lot of people on your side take, that we've done a lot of the enforcement and it hasn't really worked all that well, or even if it has, it's imbalanced and we need some legalization too. It's just, in my opinion, is just not true. We haven't done the kind of consistent across-the-board enforcement. I mean, there are obvious things that we still refuse to do. The Social Security Administration, knows, and the IRS know where hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants are, and they won't tell the Immigration Service. I mean, things as basic as that we're not doing.
I just think that that's a little facile, and I think it's, this is about the DREAM Act. I just want to, the problem with almost every enforcement effort that you do has unintended consequences, and those unintended consequences are magnified when you start out with a situation where you have 11 million undocumented immigrants and 7-point-something million workers who have, and all their employers, like you say, whose interest is in trying to get around that system. And what happens is you have a bigger unregulated workforce. You have a bigger, you sort of force people underground. We have to talk about. It's a longer talk and a different talk about how do we solve the overall problem. And we might have some areas where we agree, but mostly we won't disagree. But what I'm saying is that that's for that discussion. Those enforcement measures that, like a partial, we've done a lot of partial enforcement measures, and we've sent a lot of messages about enforcement. And these kids are getting older and older, and, the kids that were graduating from high school, when the DREAM Act was first proposed, and I was working on it then. Now it's more than 10 years later. So if they were 18 then, they're 28 today. That's just, we're losing that generation, the talent that they could be providing, because they didn't have these incentives to stay in school. And the ones that were able to stay in school, they had to fight these enormous obstacles and be afraid of being deported. And it's just not a good policy with respect to these kids. And while we're waiting to solve the bigger problem, we should do something, right and fair by these kids, and that's also going to benefit us. And we shouldn't cut our nose off to spite our face and say we're not going to do anything at all until we can do everything
Well, there's a couple. There's probably one thing I agree with you on is that if we had dealt with these young people a long time ago through a much narrower Dream Act, you would in fact not have the problem to some extent, especially with these young people today.
So you're saying much narrower. I just want to know, like, what do you mean? Because you've said that
I would
you want
say
the age.
7 people who came here at 7 and younger.
So somebody that came here, that was brought here at 10 years old and is American in every single way and is a valedictorian in their school should be treated like a criminal and should be rounded up and deported.
Deportation is not a criminal process.
Live their life.
What you're saying
I know, but you get arrested, you get put in detention.
What you're saying is that a kid who's lived in the house that his parents took out a mortgage on and has grown up there, and those parents were unable to pay their mortgage, that kid should be able to continue to live there.
No.
But it's the same principle. That's my point. The parents subjected the children to the situation, either whether they took out a mortgage they couldn't afford or whether they knowingly snuck into the country or overstayed a visa, putting their children in this position.
But this is not about that.
Parents are morally culpable, and it's not the American people's responsibility to clean up their mess.
It's not their. So just a couple of things. This is a lot of things. It's not the American people's responsibility to clean up their mess. I'm just saying that this is actually going to benefit the American people. It's going to benefit us. They'll pay more taxes. They'll put more into the economy. They'll contribute more. They will have, and also, we won't be wasting Homeland Security resources on them. So it's actually better. We're not being responsible. We're doing something that's going to help us. And so that's kind of, and I really don't agree with this thing about staying in the house. That would you take away the house from somebody who is defaulted on their mortgage, and that's about the parent and that's you're acting on the parent and the kid. Because they're the kids of the parent, that affects them. But these, when you arrest somebody for deportation, it's not the parent that's getting arrested. It's that child or the child who's grown up and is now 20, let's say. And so you're arresting that 20-year-old, and then you're taking that 20-year-old and you're putting them into detention for however many weeks or months. And then you're sending them to a country that they barely remember, even if they came here when they were 12 years old. That's not where their friends are. That's not where they have connections. And so that's all against the kid. That's not about the parent. The parents are out of the picture at that point. And so
first of all, they shouldn't be. I mean, when they pick the kid up, they ought to go get the parents and send them together back home, which is often what happens in these cases. And the fact remains, though, the parents are the ones who are morally responsible here. What you're asking for is an extraordinary act of grace on the part of the American people, giving the parents something they wanted, which is their kids being able to stay legally. That's one of the things the parents came here for. They're being rewarded.
But the big impact is not on the parents. The big impact is on the kids.
I understand that.
And the direct impact, and we do not, like if a parent robs a bank, they might be trying to provide money for their kids, and that might be why they robbed the bank. But we put the parent in jail. We don't put the kid in jail.
But the kid is still harmed. In this case, again, if you're in some part of you're in New York City and you commit a crime, you're sent to prison way upstate. Your kids are without a parent.
Right, and that's the same if you're deported. If the parent is deported, if the parent is, if you arrest the parent, and because the parent came here illegally, and you send the parent back, and the child stays here, which we're talking about, to the Dream Act. That's the same situation, that we're going after the parent who is responsible for what they did, and we're not going after the kid who was not responsible for coming here.
Parents are responsible for the kid's situation, for the kid being here in the first place.
That's absolutely true.
And my point is that the only people I think I can make a case for to myself, and frankly, you can make a case to the public, should receive this extraordinary act of grace, are those who have been here for practically their whole lives, and literally have no memory or history or development or identity in that home country. That's a sympathetic group of people, and the problem is that the supporters of the Dream Act are trying to bootstrap a much broader amnesty for...
But it's not broader. It's up to 15 years old, and we've talked about why that is. There's that's a disagreement. We can let our viewers decide. I really disagree with you about where the American people are. The American people overwhelmingly support the DREAM Act, and it's not just because of...
Depends how you ask the question and all of that. I mean, in a representative republic, it's the elected representatives, the people who decide this sort of thing, and there's clearly no strong support for the DREAM Act, because frankly, if there were, why didn't the Democratic Congress bring this up in early 2009? I mean, that's the thing I think we should just talk about in the last couple of minutes, is the politics of it. Because early last year, I was on a panel with a couple of prominent legalization advocates, one in Homeland Security, government person, one an outside activist. Both of them were categorical that under no circumstances should the DREAM Act or ag jobs, which is another piecemeal measure, should ever be brought up as a freestanding measure, but rather only should be considered folded into a much broader measure. In other words, what I take from this is that the DREAM Act has been used now for 10 years as a kind of stalking horse for a bigger amnesty, as a way of saying, look at this kid brought here at 3 years old, he's a valedictorian, therefore you should vote for amnesty for 11 million people. That, I think, was a marketing strategy, a clearly conscious marketing strategy that's failed, and now at the last minute, after the whole debate has been tainted by these tactics, they now want to move ahead on this narrower measure. If they'd done this 2 years ago, they might have succeeded, and I want to know why they didn't.
So I'll just tell you, I think that it's kind of pejorative. I think that the people that support, I'm trying to use nice words, that support enforcement, they have their marketing strategies too, and they bring up a lot of criminals, and they say that that all undocumented immigrants are criminals and bring disease and do all these things.
That happens, and I try to avoid that kind of talk, and frankly, the more responsible restrictionists don't use that kind of tactics. But the problem is that the people on the pro-legalization side, the people at the center, the important actors, are the ones trying to use the DREAM Act as a kind of stalking horse.
Well, if you think about who the Federation for America, if you think, I just don't let's agree to disagree about that, but I just want to point out that everybody's trying to put their their strongest point forward, and of course, if all immigrants if all undocumented immigrants were criminals, then I would be on your side.
Sure, I get that.
And so probably if all undocumented immigrants were 2 years old, maybe you'd be on my side.
If they were all 2 years old, yeah, sure, maybe.
So I think that let's not talk about marketing strategies and things like that, because I think that's kind of beside the point. I do agree with you that the DREAM Act has been, and the fate of these young people has been caught up in the bigger debate. And to me, when I hear you say that this is a really good advertisement for comprehensive immigration reform, and so that they're using it as a stalking horse, then maybe to me, then you would want to pass the DREAM Act, because then it would take them off the table, and there wouldn't be any opportunity to use these kids who.
Well, yeah, and that's explicitly been the fear of the pro-comprehensive reform people, is that if the DREAM Act were to pass, even the version you would like, rather than a much narrower, tighter version, it would still take the issue off the table. These sympathetic young people wouldn't be available for news interviews. Congress would say, look, we did this for you, don't come back to us for the next 10 years. That's why it's only come 2 years after the Democratic Congress took over that they actually have had real movement on this. My point is, if these young people don't get legal status, and they won't, the DREAM Act is going to fail. This is on tape, so you can hold me to it.
Okay.
I'm
kind of optimistic.
It is the pro-comprehensive people who are responsible for that failure, and that conflict between the DREAM activist kids and the activists here in Washington really did come out in public earlier this year, because the kids were saying, look, we're not getting any younger, we want to move on this and forget about the whole comprehensive thing. Right. And the national groups were pushing back against that, and only now have decided to go for this piecemeal measure.
So there was a disagreement. I'll agree with you. There was a different disagreement among different sectors of people who all want a comprehensive, total solution. There's a disagreement about strategy and about whether, and I don't really agree completely that it's just that they're the most sympathetic or whatever, or that people were afraid. I mean, the other reality is that you only have so many immigration votes in Congress, and so I think there's a calculation that by some that it's better to have that vote be one that tries to fix the whole problem.
Right.
And
that's
my
point is that
we're not going to fix the whole problem. So why not fix this problem? And I think that's where probably the American people and definitely those who have been in a pro-immigrant society, that's where they are.
Yeah, no, I understand. And if, like I said, if they
it
really
just makes it
want
sound
to
really
fix,
cynical, but I don't really think it's cynical. I think it's just honest disagreements about how can we get the best outcome.
yes, no, I agree. I mean, I'm not actually. I don't. I mean, there is a certain amount of cynicism to it, but it's a political calculation. That's what you do in politics.
Right.
My
Exactly.
point is that the pro-comprehensive folks, the one who want a broader legalization,
Which I'll put myself in that.
Yeah. But I mean, not whether you specifically, I have no idea. But yes, your party,
Absolutely.
if you will, overreached. They figured they could get everything, and weren't going to try to get one slice of the loaf. They wanted the whole loaf. They demanded it over and over and over again, and that's gotten them in trouble. And if these young people don't get legal status, if some version of the DREAM Act does not pass, and again, it's not going to pass this year, they've got nobody to blame but the comprehensive groups that turned down the chance at a more modest legalization, maybe for sincere reasons, but nonetheless, the failure is securely on the side of those who wanted the whole loaf.
Well, hindsight is 2020, but I actually think that we're gonna have a vote in the House and the Senate coming up in the next week or so, and I think that I'm more optimistic than you might say.
Well, I'm optimistic, but I'm optimistic for
right?
myself.
So I'm more hopeful than you are about what the outcome of that is going to be. But I really think that especially in the House, there's they only need Democrats in the lame duck who is needed are Democrats who may not support like you say, the whole comprehensive solution, but that understand that these kids, that there's something different about these kids. In the Senate, it's really interesting because the original sponsor of the DREAM Act was Orrin Hatch, a conservative Republican.
Who's going to have to face his voters in 2 years, and that's why he's backing away from it.
Well, again, I think it's very popular, but then what you have is the question that I have is, are people like Orrin Hatch and others who have co-sponsored and believe him, I think nobody ever thought that the DREAM Act, nobody ever realized how popular until polls, like in the last couple of years, how popular the DREAM Act was. And I don't think that Orrin Hatch or Dick Lugar or the other, several other Republicans who in the past supported the DREAM Act, I don't think they were doing it for political reasons. I think that there is, a kind of a sense that in the Republican primaries, there's like a capture, and they're making a calculation. Well, even though I believe in this, they might make a calculation. Even though I believe in this, I might have to vote against it, or they might, and I'm kind of hopeful, they might actually vote what they believe and do the right thing, and enough of them will do that the DREAM Act can get it needs 60 votes, so that's the same threshold that so much legislation has in the Senate. But it only if all of the senators who support the DREAM Act in their hearts vote for it, then it'll.
Well, you're
pass.
assuming their co-sponsorship had something to do with their heart in the first place.
Well, I don't think they thought they were. I think they always thought it was a dangerous. And I've talked to them. I think they always thought it was a dangerous thing that they were not doing. Honestly, the reason they did it mostly is they met some some DREAM Act students, and I think they thought it was the right thing to do. And that some of the people that we've talked about earlier, kids who've really excelled, kids who've really tried to do the right thing, haven't done anything wrong, have stayed in school, have really, they are in the embodiment of the American dream. I think you would agree with that.
But Josh,
and
again,
even whether or not, and that's what made Republicans. Just let me finish, and then that's what made Republicans, sympathetic to them and want to be helpful. And the question, and I think they still believe that honestly in their heart of hearts. And I'm hoping that they will, that we can take a little bit of the politics out and that they'll do the right thing.
But I'll just finish with, on my side by saying, if the DREAM Act had been tailored differently to a much narrower group of kids, much more sympathetic group of kids, in my opinion, publicly sympathetic, and had tougher enforcement measures, some enforcement measures in it, which it doesn't, and as the last thing, had some way of preventing any relatives of these legalized kids from ever getting legal status, from ever benefiting from the fact they got an amnesty, so they wouldn't be able to petition for them as immigrants. This is something that could heck, if I were in Congress, I might vote for something, a piece of legislation along those lines. My point is that they're sacrificing that group of kids in order to pass a broader measure, and those kids brought here at young ages need to, are going to have to ask, why did we not get legalized? And the reason is the measure that would have legalized them was defective, was incomplete.
I think that people on your side don't want anything that's going to move in that direction. And honestly, very, very modest pro-immigration legislation has a really tough time of moving in Congress, much more modest than even the DREAM Act. So I don't think, even if you made it that only if you're up to 6 months old, I don't think that is going to do much better.
Yeah, I think it would, actually. Yes,
but there is a proof in the pudding, because the most recent bill, they tried. They're saying, your thing about chain migration, that they're going to bring in their cousins and their, that's really taken care of, because they cannot even begin to immigrate anybody in the most recent version. They can't even begin to the petition process, which takes, as you know, takes years. For at least 10 years, and they can't even start to petition for their parents for at least 13 years under the newest version, and that's just the beginning of the process. And so I think that part has been taken off of the table, and really a lot of the other types of objections, like that somebody sincere like yourself might raise, have really been addressed in the most recent version, and it's a much more pure vote of really. The only thing that you really pointed out that I think is a fair one, if you don't think that a 12-year-old, is responsible for what they did and should be caught up in the larger immigration debate because they were brought here when they were 12 instead of when they were 7, then you're right. Then we will disagree, and I'm interested. I'd be interested in seeing what our viewers disagree or not.
My concern really is that this is a debate that they should have launched in, say, February of 2009, in which case some of these issues might have been hashed out, and you might have ended up with a DREAM Act that had a cutoff of, say, 10 instead of 16. That might have passed with a Democratic president, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate. Doing it in the lame duck is dishonest. That really is the only way I can say it. Not on your part, because you're on the outside, you want to get what you can, but for the congressional leadership, the Democratic leadership, to push this only after they've been wiped out at the polls and have a window of opportunity. That is cynical. And
so, as you know, they tried in September, and they were told, and it was said, well, this is just before an election, so you're just doing it for cynical
politics. So let's not do it, is what they said.
No, they said this is cynical politics. I don't think that you would be able to say it's cynical politics if people didn't like it. They said that Reid was doing it for his political purposes, and so I think
and they
say, well, after the election, then do it when there's not. Well, they just attached it to a bill that was the best bill that they could find in order to have a clean vote on the DREAM Act without bringing in a lot of extraneous things. But so I mean, if it's just before the election, it's the wrong time. If it's just after the election, it's the wrong time.
And they had 2 years before this. I mean,
but this is 2 years from an election. This is the least political time to do it. And as you know, they're not going to be able to do it because the House will be in the hands of really, again, I'm trying not to use pejorative words which come to my mind, people that are really opposed to the DREAM Act,
exactly.
Strongly opposed to the DREAM Act. Right. So there's not really a chance after the election. I mean, after the new Congress takes power. So this is the time, and to get it done. And again, like I said, I'm hoping that we're 2 years away from an election, from any election. I really do hope that the House and Senate will do something that will make our system saner, that will help us because it'll benefit our economy, and it'll help us because it'll allow us to focus our immigration enforcement resources on in a better place. So I think I'm just hoping that that sanity in that sense will prevail. I'll let you have the last word, Mark.
Well, I mean, we've already hashed this out, so needless to say, I disagree on the substance of it. And even just as a political assessment, I just don't think it's going to happen. Even if it passes in the House, which I think is not that likely, I don't see it happening in the Senate. It's not going to get to the president's desk. And it's sort of Lucy pulling the football away from Charlie Brown one more time. And if I were some of these young people who could have gotten legal status and isn't going to get it now, it's Republicans are not the first people that they should be calling up and asking why didn't this happen.
Well, I never saw anybody saying, honestly, I never heard anybody in Congress say we should do this for 7-year-olds, and I would have been opposed to making that change because of the reasons that I said. I think people that were brought here when they were 12 shouldn't be cut out of this opportunity.
So
and
why
it's not good for us if they do.
And why should people who are 16 years old in 1 month be cut off? I mean, again,
that's right. Well, I agree with you that there's
why not 18, because that's where minority ends. Why not 21? Why not 26, which is where the health care bill says you can't be under your parents' health insurance anymore. I mean, there's
a lot of arbitrary. Right. So I think that if you're 12 or 13 or 14 or 15, that to me, and again, I'm on the side of, I think we should err on the side of when you're 15 years old. I mean, again, I'll leave it up to the viewers. If you're 15 years old and you're brought here by your parents, are you really should that person be treated the same, which they are under current immigration law, as somebody who's in their 20s and comes here on their own volition?
And I think we should err on the other side, if you will, where we start where there is the most consensus and the least disagreement, and take our first steps there. We're up at over 50 minutes. So
yes.
So anyway, it was a good talk, and hopefully we'll do this again.
Okay, Mark. Nice talking to you.
Okay, likewise.
Bye-bye.